Welcome to the inaugural episode of Reactionary Minds, a podcast from the UnPopulist. I'm your host, Aaron Ross Powell. Reactionary Minds is a show about why some people reject liberalism and what the rest of us can do about it. This first episode is all about introducing the problem Reactionary Minds exists to address. What is a liberalism? Why is it on the rise? And why should we be concerned about it? My guest today is Shikha Dalmia, editor of the UnPopulist newsletter and fellow at the Mercatus Center's program on Pluralism and Civil Exchange. Welcome to the show, Shikha.
Thanks for having me, Aaron.
What is populism?
It's a good question. And as you've noticed, the name of my newsletter is the UnPopulist. And the newsletter is largely an effort to address the authoritarian currents we are seeing around the world. So then the question arises, why am I calling it the UnPopulist and not the anti-authoritarian or something like that? And partly because it's cuter. But the more serious reason is that the kind of illiberalism and the kind of authoritarianism we are seeing around the world has what is essentially a populist element. And now there's a lot of confusion around the word populism, and there is actually a great deal of effort on the left to try and take back this word which they think has been unfairly characterized in the last 6 years with the rise of the Trump era and, the MAGA era. And, so I actually in some ways feel for some of the left-wing writers like Thomas Frank, who's a public intellectual and an author, and he's something of a Bernie Sanders progressive. And he wrote a book not too long ago defending the term populism because he sees populism as essentially a movement of the people. Roger Cohen, a New York Times columnist, similarly wrote another column in, I think it was like 2018, shortly after Trump, where he also was lamenting the fact that the term populism has acquired this negative connotation. Now, I actually feel for some of these liberals because, as you and I know, we are still grieving the loss of the term liberal. However, I think they fundamentally misunderstand what populism really means and why it has a bad connotation. To some extent, it's a semantic issue. You can give any phenomenon any name. But populism, for the longest time, has had a bad odor of it because they see populism as essentially a popular movement that is supposed to do the most good for the most people. And those most people are not the rich people. They are generally, middle income or lower middle income people who are the vast majority of the population. But that's not what populism really is. It's not a popular movement. A populist movement, if you read the literature on it, which admittedly is murky, it's about pitting the real people against some other entity. And that entity is the elites usually. So the elites are considered to be sort of these corrupt oligarchs, and the people are supposed to be these pure, something pure representing something good. And so there is this division between the elite, which controls the establishment, and the pure people whose interests are being avoided. Now, even that exactly doesn't capture the problem with the term populism. The term populism gets its bad odor from the fact that it's not just that the real people are trying to get their way and have their preferred policies enacted. It is more that they want to flatten certain elements of liberalism, the deliberative process, the representative process, because they believe it's been captured by some bad people, by the establishment which is not representing them. And so it's an effort to flatten certain institutions of liberalism, not improve them, not reform them, but simply to either sidestep them or do an end run around them or even just get rid of them so that the real people can have their will. Now, obviously, the real people can't govern. There are too many of them. Somebody has to govern for them. So in some senses, the term, populist and authoritarian seem like they are antipoles, but actually they come together because always, inevitably, when you have a populist movement, some authoritarian figure, some demagogue arises who will say he represents the people. And he will usually, it could be a he, very occasionally there have been some she's, he or she will say they are representing the people, but very often, and this, we saw very clearly with Trump, we the people became me the people. So they are not representing the people, they are the people. So populism inevitably goes hand in hand with a certain kind of authoritarianism. And so therefore, the term unpopulist, and therefore why populism is something to be worried about.
I think that's one of the interesting things about watching the rise of populism in the U.S. over the last 5 or 6 or 7 years has been that it's framed as an anti-elite movement, and draining the swamp is an anti-elite thing. And we're constantly hearing about these coastal cities with these out-of-touch elites who don't understand the real people, which real Americans in this context inevitably just means rural, working-class whites. But then the leadership is a fantastically wealthy, though we don't know quite how wealthy because his finances are a little sketchy, but fantastically wealthy businessman. And then in Congress, the figureheads for it, or at least people trying to claim that mantle, tend to be Ivy League law school educated pretenders to the common man identity. And you're right, it is this odd thing where what begins as a movement framing itself as of the people turns into, in practice, effectively a personality cult. That's no longer about the people, but it's no longer about the people's identity. It's about the people building their identity through fealty to this strong man leader, which is then how it can very quickly turn into an authoritarian movement, because either that leader's power when he has to do something is seen as absolute because he's the embodiment of our hopes and dreams and cultural identity, or when that leader's position is threatened, as we saw when Trump lost the election, it can morph quickly into violence in defense of that leader's status, not so much the working class or the common man status, but defending that leader from perceived failure.
That's right. And there is actually, now populism can be of both the left-wing and the right-wing varieties. And we have seen them, throughout history. I mean, Latin America has had populism of every strain. And in every instance, it has led to the cult of the personality. But there are two things in populism. So there is a cult of personality, which is the leader. And then there is a cult of the people, too. There is a certain deification of the people, that they are the true owners of the society. Their will needs to be respected. And so the two, the cult of the leader and the cult of the people, sort of build on each other. They both deify each other. And, whether it is Hugo Chavez, whether it is Bolsonaro right now, although Bolsonaro is interesting and he's losing some of his popularity. But Trump is a classic phenomenon of a cult leader, of a demagogue who is leading in the name of the real people, and then the real people deify him. And he really was a deity in certain MAGA circles, and he in turn deifies them in his rallies. I mean, if you watched some of his rallies, which I tried to avoid as much as possible, but, he was constantly flattering the people there. It was, you people are great and you are being ignored. And so, yes, so there is this sort of the mutual cult of the leader and the cult of the people that goes hand in hand in a, populist movement.
I want to stay for a moment on our terms and taxonomies, because the purpose of this show ultimately is not just to critique illiberal and populist ideas, but to try to understand them, to try to understand where these people are coming from, what the philosophies and personality traits and historical perspectives that inform them, because it's hard to challenge ideas without understanding them deeply and to the extent you can fairly. So we talked about what populism is, but this show is not called The Authoritarian Mind. It's not called The Populist mind. It is called Reactionary Minds. And so where does the term reactionary fit into all this?
So, Erin, this is your show. So, you and I both talked about why we like reactionary minds. And I'll give you my side of why I like it. And perhaps you can say something about why you like it. So, the textbook definition of reactionary is a person or a sensibility that is opposed to economic or political liberalization of any kind. And so usually it goes along with a certain conservative mentality. But I think there's another element to the reactionary sensibility, and that is it is also sort of anti-ideas and it's anti-intellectual. And the reason is ideas and intellectual theories then can lead to change. They can lead to, certain, they require a certain amount of openness to the world and to knowledge, and those can be intensely threatening to existing cultural orders, right? And so in that sense, reactionary minds, I think, is a good way to describe this show. Because as you and I are both, as we know, quite troubled and perturbed by the last 6 years. I mean, things are happening in America that we never thought would be possible. And we think that there needs to be some kind of a response to this, right? But we can't really fight these ideologies unless we understand them. And so we do want to understand the reactionary movement that's brewing in America on its own terms. And so that's sort of the reason I like the term reactionary minds.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And what I would add is I think that you can make the case that ideology, political ideology, moral ideology, and so on, is to some extent downstream of personality, that we tend to have different personal and personality preferences, and then we sometimes look around for theories or intellectual edifices that provide structure to them or support them or don't really challenge them. And in that regard, I think reactionary is also a personality type that says I am turned off by, sometimes threatened by diversity, by change, by things being different than the way that I'm used to, or people who aren't like me being more prominent than they used to be, or higher status than they used to be, or the way we talk about language is changing, and that bugs me. And I don't like these kids with their, asking me to use different pronouns or different terminology. Like there is this set in my waysness that drives a lot of this. And it's not an accident that Trump, he led with, when he was first running for president, he led with anti-immigration, with a xenophobic perspective and a nationalism that was the corollary of that, because for a lot of his most faithful followers, it's America is looking different than either the way I was used to it being, or the way that I imagined it being, or the way that I would like it to look. Demographic, on the far fringes of the populists, we get great replacement theory about they're trying to change the demographics of the country to make it less white than it used to be. There is this very I don't like difference, and then reacting strongly against that. And then that feeds into political preferences, which is I'm going to vote for the person who will stop the change, whether that's preventing immigrants who don't look and talk like me from coming into the country, or will elevate the status of the people who have the same preferences I do against the people with the diverse preferences that I dislike. And that's another thing that I want to dig into on this show is the way that there is such a thing, I think, as a populist or an authoritarian or reactionary, like psychology as well. So there's ideas that inform it, but there's also just beliefs and values and attitudes, and they end up mixing together into this very toxic political outcome. But that was the attraction to me of the Reactionary Minds, because it gets both the notion that this is an ideological perspective, but also that this is just an attitudinal perspective.
Right. That's very well stated, Aaron. I would, however, push back just slightly in that, we do want to make a distinction between the conservative mind and the reactionary mind, right? I mean, Bill Buckley's very famous statement about when he launched the National Review was, he wants to stand athwart history and, screaming or yelling, stop. And, there is a way in which, even though I am not a conservative, never have been, never will be, I can understand the urge to be careful about change and to, reform and to be a little deliberative, to, you don't want to simply throw out existing social arrangements just because there is some fad, that has taken hold of the land. So there is a way in which conservatives, even though I'm not a conservative, they can be incrementalist but not completely opposed to reform. Reactionaries, I think, is conservatism on steroids in that sense. Reactionaries simply don't want change because they don't like change. And usually, like I said, reactionariness is a phenomenon that's usually associated with conservatism. But to the extent that it's not just any change that reactionaries are opposed to, it's actually liberalism that they are opposed to. It's liberalization they are opposed to. To the extent it's liberalization they are opposed to, they can even come from the progressive side, right? Like communists, when China liberalized its economy to some extent, there were reactionaries in China, who wanted the communist order to hold and they didn't want liberalization. So in that sense, I like the term reactionary because potentially it will even capture the leftist reactionary.
And I think that often manifests in the contemporary American left as an intolerance of difference that is, it's not the same as the intolerance of difference that we see from the right, which is obviously very much there, but rather we being the left thinks we have advanced, we have liberalized. So certain behaviors that used to be socially unacceptable are now considered normal, or certain underprivileged groups that used to be underprivileged are now considered no different than everyone else. And that liberalization is good. That's the kind of liberalization we want. But there is a tendency among some people on the left to then be incredibly intolerant, not of difference in the political realm. So not of it's one thing to say yes, we should, people who want to recriminalize gay marriage or gay relationships, that's bad. But it's people who themselves in their own lives are not affirmatively supportive of these things, need to be stamped out, need to be punished. And so this often can manifest in the left's wanting to punish businesses that weren't supportive of gay weddings. Baking cakes for gay weddings, the small conservative baker says, that's against my conscience. I don't want to bake a cake for your wedding. In a genuinely liberal society, the answer to that is, okay, I will go somewhere else and get a cake from somewhere else and kind of no harm, no foul. But the liberalism that manifests on the left is no, it's not enough that you are just saying, hey, I don't want to participate. You have to participate and embrace, or we are going to, in this case, try to use the state to punish you, to destroy your business, to fine you, to drive you out because you're not one of us. And that ends up with this ratcheting up of the reactionariness, because then what that says to the people who are more culturally conservative is, I need to dig in even deeper, because if the culture drifts in a more liberal direction, that's even more grounds for me to be punished, often with state force. And so I need to fight even harder because I won't be tolerated.
Right. That's exactly the dynamic we are in right now. The problem with the left is that it's too impatient. And to some extent, one can understand its impatience, right? I mean, I think systemic injustices are prevalent. Systemic racism is a thing. And we all do need to, grapple with legacies of slavery, Jim Crow. All of that is correct. The problem with the left is it doesn't want to do the real hard work of changing hearts and minds. It wants to grab power nodes and exercise and, push on them to engineer change. And it's not just the state that that they are the levers of the state that they are using. It's also the levers of, corporate power and, what have you. Not all of them are illicit. Some of them are perfectly acceptable. I mean, certain kinds of boycotts against clearly beyond the pale views is probably acceptable. But they have lost the capacity, of making distinctions between, good-natured fear of what they are asking for and a reactionary fear, I guess. And it's like this lack of calibration and this lack of finesse in their techniques, which is, I think, which is a big problem, which is in some ways driving a more reactionary attitude on the part of the conservatives, bringing out their worst tendencies. But I actually don't want to simply blame the left for it also. I mean, I think the conservatives always wanted, a certain kind of conservative mind that was always uncomfortable with certain social changes, gay marriage or what have you. They've also been looking for a pretext to dig in. So I think to some extent, the left is giving them a pretext. It's not a reason. It's a pretext for, their reactionariness. It's hard to untangle all of this, I admit. But all these currents are right now with us.
But at their core, they're all ultimately a rejection of genuine liberalism, which is, if nothing else, it is a belief in a social tolerance and social pluralism of, if we're going to live together in a big society, commonly governed, we have to get along with each other. And the way that you get along with each other, given our diversity of viewpoints and values and preferences and backgrounds and so on, is to tolerate difference, is to say, I'm going to let you live the way that you want to live, and I'm going to live the way that I want to live. And even if I'm not celebrating the choices that you make, I'm accepting them as part of this liberal consensus. But so much of what we're seeing now seems to be a rejection of that liberal consensus of saying, no, it's not just that I think I am right in, all of us think we're right in our own preferences and values, or we wouldn't hold them. So it's not just that, it's saying, therefore, anyone who differs from my preferences and values is wrong, and is wrong to an extent that they are dangerous or a threat or impure or in some other way need to be, whether it's with the state or other mechanisms, need to be shut down, excluded, punished, so that we can have a higher degree of uniformity that happens to align with my preferences.
Right. I think somebody said, Obama, when he became president, he was against gay marriage. He was against all kinds of pro-gay policies. And then, of course, during the course of his presidency, he changed his mind and pushed all kinds of gay issues. So, I wonder if there is any room for Obama in the current left, right? I mean, that evolution of thinking. I mean, now I think Obama was always there and, he was holding back for strategic reasons, which turned out to actually be, not bad reasons. But right. I mean, and it's not, and and you can see the growing intolerance of the left in that it's not just being censorious against the right, but it's also being censorious on its own, to its own, which is why, in a way, I'm a little less worried about the left, because the left, in its demand for sort of purity and consistency, it's in a way, becoming less united, and it's sort of beginning to is at that stage of devouring its own. And so there are pushback currents. I mean, the left is generating now healthy pushback. I mean, I actually think if Trump had not arrived on the horizon, right, there was so much concern within the left about the left that right now we would be in a much better position with respect to the left. But with Trump arriving on the scene, I mean, I feel myself pivoting. I mean, I think there is no bigger threat in this country than the right, because it has become so completely not just reactionary, but authoritarian and illiberal in 30 different ways that I've had to drop my attention on the left and now, the right is the big problem. But before Trump arrived, I remember Vox, which is by no means right-wing, let alone even a centrist publication, very much a progressive publication. But I recall it had written, or it had published a piece by a liberal professor saying, "My liberal students terrify me." And this piece went on to say that conservative students in his class, this was a professor who said in a liberal arts college, who said the conservative students in his class will push back, might not like his ideas, but are still willing to discuss them. Liberal students were not willing to do that. Now, what we are seeing, on the other hand, is that the right has taken what was, is no longer simply pushing back against what were legitimately called left-wing excesses. It wants to just crush them, right? Now you are seeing bills banning the teaching of critical race theory. That's where the reactionariness comes in, right? This is no longer now about calibrating the pace of the change. It's not about that. Now we are only going to impose our vision from 200 years ago or, 150 years ago. Now it has taken a completely different, cant, and it's in a completely different orbit.
We've talked about Trumpism as exemplary of the kind of populism that we are concerned about. But is Trump the major figure, or who are the other figures that are important to understand when looking at the lay of the land on American populism, left or right, like the main, I guess, influencers, as the kids say?
Well, populism in America, depending upon how you use the term, has a long history. I mean, the first populist movement was the People's Party in 1890, which was a third party. And it was this agrarian movement and labor movement against the industrialization that was happening, the building of the railroads. Lots of people were dispossessed, traditional livelihoods were lost. That is generally regarded as the first populist movement in this country. It got co-opted by the Democratic Party, which became the Labor Union Party. It actually, the People's Party, put its lot behind William Bryan Jennings. And when he lost the election that year, it kind of spelled the end of that party, but it got co-opted by Democrats, right? Now it's a completely different situation. I mean, you've seen certain other populist movements. I mean, arguably, the George Wallace, he was a populist phenomenon, very much appealing to the same kinds of anxieties that Trump now appealed to. In between, you had sort of the Tea Party movement. You also had the Occupy Wall Street movement. The difference is that the Tea Party, I think, was the beginning of this turn towards MAGAism. Although, interestingly, the Tea Party movement was very much, pitching itself as this constitutional movement. It wanted to return to the founders. It wanted to limit the scope of the government, all of which went out of the window when Trump came along. But I think, Trump is not sui generis. I mean, partly the Tea Party is behind that, but partly I think, we had the phenomenon of right-wing radio with the advent of Rush Limbaugh, who started pushing all kinds of populist tropes, right? I mean, he was a nativist. He was, anti-left. I mean, the preoccupation with the leftist enemy is a huge, huge part of the right now. I mean, I think that's the single biggest motivating force. I think even the anti-immigration and the anti-immigrant animus is not quite as powerful a force as the fear and the anger and with the left is. Hatred of the left, actually. And I think Rush Limbaugh started stoking that. And then you had a whole slew of copycats on the right. And I think that kind of paved the way for Trump. The right was kind of primed for a populist takeover. And then Trump came along with his MAGA message. And at that stage, all the right wanted was to use the levers of the state to smash the left and impose its vision of, a pretty sort of insulated, closed American, polity.
And this isn't new, even with Trump, even with Rush Limbaugh. I mean, this is what we watched in the 50s and 60s with anti-communism. Was the Soviet Union was a legitimate threat, although maybe in retrospect, not as big of a threat as we thought it were at the time. There were communists in the country, although America was not going to they weren't going to win out. America was not going to turn communist, but they did exist, and communism was very bad. But the American right used that as a way to exert the power of the federal government to punish particularly culturally left people or people who were calling for liberalization of the positions of blacks or gays or women and so on, that there's this urge to define an enemy and then use a potentially like an inflated threat of that enemy or mischaracterizations of that enemy or straw man versions of that enemy to have this to justify a reactionary turn is very strong. And it makes me think it was interesting a moment ago we were talking about Trump and how there was this, you said like had Trump not come along, the left would have fractured more than it did. And so what's interesting about Trump is that he unified both the right and the left into these deeply tribally opposed camps that there were, I mean, for decades, the conservative movement was split between there was the base that looked very much like Trumpism does now and has, that conservative kind of right reactionary base has been around as long as there has been a right. But you had the elites, the Bill Buckley types or the Ronald Reagan or then the Paul Ryan who managed to kind of have control of the GOP and push it in a more, if not liberal, at least more liberal adjacent on its best days direction. But that went away with Trump, and suddenly the elites all kind of either swore fealty or at least shut up about their criticisms of the really reactionary right. And then on the left, you had exactly that the left, those fault lines went away because we had a unified enemy. Trump won't be around forever. And so it does. There's a sense in which that kind of potentially gives a way out of when that enemy has gone away. I mean, there are other people like what DeSantis is doing in Florida right now. He's clearly trying to tee himself up as the inheritor of the Trump mantle. But it's questionable whether any of the people trying to do that have Trump's, I want to call it charisma, but a lot of people think of it as such, but like Trump's showmanship and there's something about him and his celebrity and all of that made him successful in the way that someone who had just spouted the same views probably would not have been. I guess, is there cause for hope there that if the populist leader goes away, then the sides will become more pluralistic than they are now?
It's a good question. No, I'm actually not optimistic about that. I mean, look, what Trump did was he didn't really unite the Republican Party, right? I mean, what he did was he united a certain element within the Republican Party, and the rest of those who didn't agree with him were either purged. I mean, Paul Ryan didn't last a year after Trump came on the scene, right? And the others have been their persona non grata within the party. And that's actually a classic populist move. I mean, it's not just that they don't respect parliamentary institutions and they don't respect the opposition. They actually turn their own party in an embodiment into themselves. And you've seen that with Trump. I mean, it's literally classic populism. So in that sense, I think he's been hugely damaging to the Republican Party. And I'm in a way that I'm not sure the Republican Party can recover from it for a very long time. Or at least I think it has to be in the political wilderness for a very long time. I mean, it has to be punished at the polls repeatedly before it'll give up this populist formula. So that's in one sense, I think. So even though there may not be a charismatic figure, and the reason I was laughing when you said charismatic, because I know to you and me, he's just so utterly not charismatic that it's hard for us to see his appeal. But there'll be other populists who will try and copy him, right? And they may not be successful, but their very presence is going to be damaging. That's one. But the more, the bigger danger of Trump is not Trump, but Trumpism. And Trumpism is essentially, an illiberal mindset that doesn't respect the checks on executive power. And it gives various factions within the conservative right therefore the sort of like the permission to use the levers of the state to promote their own vision. So you've written about this, sort of the integralist movement, right? Why is that emerging now? The NatCon, National Conservative Movement, why is that emerging now? He's actually fractured, whatever little uneasy fusion consensus there was in the right, and allowed these illiberal, monster children of MAGAism now to assert themselves. So I actually think things are going to get much worse before they get better.
Well, let's turn briefly to the integralist movement and the national conservatism movement, which have some overlap but are distinct in other ways, because they represent an interesting move on the part of the conservative elite to try to take on the energy of Trumpism, of Trumpist populism, but intellectualize it because Trumpism is basically all id. There's not an intellectual, philosophical through line there. But the national conservatives and the integralists are saying, no, there is a philosophical case against liberalism, that liberalism has failed in their words, for reasons inherent to it, and that we need to embrace non-liberal, like well thought out philosophical positions, because that's the thing is, if Trump is just spouting id, the integralists and the national conservatives have legitimately thoughtful and often interesting thinkers articulating these views in ways that are, I think they're wrong, and I think they're often dangerously wrong, but they're not stupid, and they're worth wrestling with. But it is interesting watching these very elites. I mean, these are law professors and philosophy professors and theologians trying to take this energy and give it, like, reapply the intellectual veneer that used to exist with Buckley and the National Review, but was shed under Trump, to reapply that intellectual veneer.
Right. I mean, the difference between Buckley and the Vermeules of the day is that Buckley was still trying to promote a certain kind of conservatism with a broadly liberal framework and a broadly liberal understanding. He agreed that checks and balances were a good thing, checks on executive power were a good thing. All of that is now out of the window, right, with these new movements. I think the discontents with liberalism are always there, because liberalism is an uneasy equilibrium between all kinds of different interests that don't comfortably fit together, right? So minorities are not happy with liberalism because liberalism doesn't give them the levers of power to instantly correct all the injustices against them. So they are always unhappy. And of course, the majority is unhappy because, especially in a, liberal democratic society, if it were to, if pure majoritarian rule were to exist, it would get its way far more frequently. So everybody is always unhappy with liberalism, but there has always been this understanding that life on the other side of liberalism is nasty, brutish, and short. So we better just stick with liberalism. And that kind of like consensus, that liberalism may be wanting, but there is no other real alternative. That understanding is completely gone, because some people have come to believe, thanks to sort of like Trump's assault on liberalism, that they can have the whole cake, right? The integralists, and you've written great stuff about this. I mean, they've written, they believe that, and integralists, as you've pointed out, are like a really weird movement because they are Catholics. They are actually a minority. And integralists within Catholicism are a really small minority. So why? Why would you want to give up liberalism? And the answer is that they think that any conservative state will give them more of what they want than they'll get from a liberal state. Ultimately, that's like, even a reactionary like Trump will give them more than, anybody else will. And so, and hence they have turned on liberalism because they just feel they are getting less out of it. And every faction within conservatism, I think, is making a similar bet. So you have, national conservatism, which is a very, very diverse movement. I mean, you have Yoram Hazony, who's an Israeli intellectual, who's the godfather of this movement, weirdly enough. You just have standard nationalists who just feel like there should be more flag waving in the United States. You have somebody like Rich Lowry, who was actually a never-Trumper and now feels that, there needs to be some kind of America firstism in America. And he's flirting with something of a blood and soil, kind of what he calls this nationalism based on geography and ancestry. And, that will rule me out as an American, as a robust American citizen. I'm not sure about you. But geography, it means like, Americans need to love the landscape of this country. The Shenandoah Valley is something that every American should do a pilgrimage to. I mean, it's all just goofy stuff, but they all feel like whatever was missing in the sort of the liberal arrangement in America, now they feel it's up for grabs, and they're all trying to make a bid for it very quickly to get what they can.
In the time that we have left, I want to turn to the future of this podcast. As I said, this is the inaugural episode of Reactionary Minds. We plan to do a lot more of these. So our goals, why we created this show and what we're hoping to get out of it. And I guess I can start on this one. I touched on this a bit earlier, but I think my goal is this rise of a liberalism is really troubling. As someone who has dedicated his career to advancing a quite radical conception of individual and economic liberty and individual autonomy and self-authorship, this is a direct assault on the values that not only I hold, but I think the ones that lead to the best world for everyone. And yeah, this has always been with us, but it has ramped up considerably. We're seeing some of it on the left. We are seeing one of the two major parties more or less entirely overtaken by it. We have seen it embodied in a president. We are seeing an increasing number of intellectuals come out in support of it in one form or another. Like, this is a real threat. And I think the value of a show like this is in trying to understand where that's all coming from and what it is that people who hold these views actually want, why they want it, what are the ideas that are leading them to it or providing support for it. And not just in I don't want this to be like a superficial understanding or a dismissive or they're all just evil kind of way, because that's easy and ultimately uninteresting. Like, my goal is to just really try to understand them on their own terms, and then to critique it from the perspective of the value of radical liberty.
That's exactly right, Aaron, and that's why I'm so excited that, you are doing this. I think this is going to be a great podcast. As you've said, plan is to understand this sort of illiberalism and its appeal at every level, psychological, social, political. So, I'm sure you'll be having guests that address all of it. And from my mind, you and I think we both have sort of more of penchants for intellectual understanding of things, right? And, Marxism has this distinction between theory and praxis. And so we like to understand things at a theoretical level. It's like it's almost an end in itself. But I think in this case, we cannot find we cannot fight illiberalism without actually understanding it. We know what we are opposing, and so there is that. And I think, in addition to sort of this theory praxis thing, I mean, this is part of like the bigger unpopulist endeavor, right? And the unpopulist endeavor will be, it's also got its theoretical side, but it's not going to shy away from like taking sides. It's not going to shy away from calling the right reactionary and taking on specific figures, political figures who are behaving in an illiberal fashion. So to me, this is going to sort of, in some ways, the theory of the reactionary minds is going to inform the praxis of unpopulist. And so there is sort of a yin and yang over here, which I'm super excited about. I really look forward to this.
Thank you for listening to Reactionary Minds, a project of the UnPopulist. If you want to learn more about the rise of illiberalism and the need to defend a free society, check out theunpopulist.substack.com.